Welcome to Human Histories.
God bless you all. God save the King.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
On, sons of the Hellenes, fight for the freedom of your country. Fight for the freedom of your children and of your wives, for the gods of your fathers and for the sepulchres of your ancestors. All are now staked upon the strife. Aeschylus. Hi everybody, I'm Ashton Myers. I'm joined today by my co-host Riley Osborne, and you're listening to Human Histories.
Hey guys, this is Riley. As per usual, I'm going to dive into how to support the podcast. If you missed the last episode, we've actually changed up a little bit how to support the podcast. The best way now is to go to humanhistories.com. There you'll be able to get access to all the sources that we use to get ready for these podcast episodes. That's all the books, and you can buy those books through affiliate links that we set up. You can also go to Patreon and donate if that's what you would like. We have all the show notes on Patreon. Ashton did a pretty incredible job with the writing for this episode, so it could be useful to you if you so choose to support us that way. Another great way to support the podcast is go over to Human Histories Podcast on Instagram. Give us a follow. We'll give you updates, cool little clips from the shows, and just it's a great way to also contact us if you decide not to go through the other route, which is to go to the website, hit contact, and shoot us an email about any questions you have. We would love to do a questions and answers episode. And yeah, let's dive right into it, man. This story is pretty epic, and it's a less told story. You know, the Battle of Marathon's super famous, but how did we get to the Battle of Marathon? You know, what caused the Persians to go on this massive invasion? And we're going to dive into that today on this episode of Human Histories.
All right, so this isn't an episode about Persia, but, you know, their fates are inexorably tied, considering that the Persians are invading Greece. But anyway, a bit of the backstory of how Darius actually got to Greece. So it's important to discuss why this battle would eventually take place. Darius the First, or Darius the Great, was the king of Persia. I think he was the third or fourth king of Persia. We'll refer to him as simply Darius for this podcast for simplicity's sake. Well, it was 513 BC, and the Babylonians were getting uppity, so he went over there to put down a revolt, and he succeeded. And shortly after that, the Persian king had set his sights on Europe, Scythia to be exact. Scythia was kind of, at that time, it was a huge range of land for the Scythians, but they were localized around like Ukraine, going up north to Russia, northeast to Russia, sorry. And there's many speculations as to why Darius sought to attack the Scythians, from them having attacked Persian lands during the Babylonian campaign, to simple military conquest, to an intimidation tactic towards the Greeks. You know, because Scythians were heavily feared. They were they're ancestors of the ancestors in the way they fought warfare of the Huns. So you could see how terrifying they were, you know, used as a kind of an intimidation tactic. Like, hey, you think you guys, you backwater barbarians over there in the Mediterranean are something to be afraid of? Well, look at how we can handle these guys. Fun fact, actually, it's speculated that Cyrus the Great, he was a king, I think he died in like 450 something in Persia, was actually killed by a Scythian queen in battle, which is insane. There's a whole little story around that, but it's pretty cool.
That's pretty awesome.
But
man.
anyway,
I would say that it's also a good point to note that, like you said, they're not actual direct ancestors to the Huns, but that's the style of people that they were, right? They were nomadic horsemen. So to actually go with what we'll dive into about how the Persians would conquest people, the Scythians are sort of the perfect example of the type of people that they wouldn't want to conquest. They're not going to get their earth and water from the Scythians, and the Scythians are able to pretty effectively just outmaneuver them. They don't really meet the Persians on the battlefield that often, and when they do, it's only when they want to meet the Persians on the battlefield because they have that maneuverability, right? When you have your entire army on horseback, you get to move your entire army at the speed of horses instead of the Persians who would have been walking places.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, he, as Riley said, they didn't get their earth and water, but what he did then do was began ordering his satrap, Megabaeus, to subdue Thrace. So basically they went into Scythia, chased around the Scythians. The Scythians, they basically, there was a correspondence between the Scythian king and Darius where Darius basically said, come fight us on open ground, you coward, or present us earth and water. And then the king said, we're not going to fight you unless you find the graves of our ancestors, which they did not. So then the Persians were like, all right, well, this is fruitless. But it wasn't actually fruitless because they did take some lands, and they did push the Scythians deep into their own territory. So while it wasn't a land grab victory like, the Persians against Babylonia or the Persians in India, it was a victory in the sense that the Scythians were afraid of outright combat and fled. But anyway, so he ordered his satrap Megabaeus to subdue Thrace. And at or around the same time, many kingdoms and independent city-states in the northern Aegean fell to Persia, willingly or otherwise. One such kingdom was Paeonia. Macedonia, too, would fall, though in this case they had capitulated. And we had mentioned water and earth like 2 seconds ago. What this meant to the Persians was outright submission, right? You're giving them land and resources, metaphorically speaking, right? Water and earth, right? Like water is our lifeblood, earth is our territory, essentially. And a little fun fact, Macedonia, most people know it as Macedonia or Macedon, the place where Alexander the Great would eventually come from. But back then, even in Rome as well, like the translation, like C's were actually K's. It was a hard C, right? Macedonia, not Macedonia.
Yeah, and just to make a couple points too, you said they're conquering these areas, but interestingly enough, what the Persians do more than anything on most of their conquests is they really, what we would call annex areas. Like you said, earth and water. The Persians are going to these areas and they're saying, hey man, if you give us earth and water, if you provide us troops and, taxes and stuff like that, and are almost like a puppet state to us, we'll sort of let you just keep doing what you're doing. And they're genuine about this. I think we'll get into a bit more later in the podcast, but the Persians really are not bad rulers if you compare them to other rulers that have existed over the course of human history. They're not that bad if you do what they say, so they really flex their muscle, but they're giving these guys an out. So Ashton, you sort of said like willingly or otherwise. Obviously, none of these states are willingly like, hey, please come over here and take us over. But when the Persians introduce this offer to them, hey man, you wanna be a sub-state or get absolutely crushed? Like, these are your two options. Like, during my research, I know it's most of these city-states and most of these smaller kingdoms are like, yeah, no, they're cool with it. They just sort of go along with it. And the Persians have a great way of sort of giving the rulers of these areas really sweet deals about how to work with them. They're like, they make it even sweeter, right? They're like, man, you're going to be even more powerful. You're going to be even wealthier. So it's a pretty easy sell to these states. And I think that's going to be really important, especially next episode when we talk about democracy, because that's sort of the example of with these city-states that have single rulers, it's a lot easier for the Persians to sort of convince these people of joining their empire. And so they successfully sort of annex a lot of the Aegean Sea, right?
No, exactly right. And that's, we mentioned his satrap Megabaeus. Might as well give you guys the backstory of what a satrap is now. A satrap is, imagine, where I live in Alberta. Say the satrap is located in Edmonton, right, which is the capital of the province. And now every other city in that province or township basically is under the purview of that satrap. So it's essentially just a governor, right? So as Riley just said, we'll see this not only next episode, but in this episode as well when we get to the Ionian Revolt. You'll have these independent Greek city-states that are ruled by tyrants, right? So now imagine you're one of these tyrants and this satrap comes in, or Darius comes in and says, hey, you like your power, right? You back us up, we can give you even more of it, right? So now if there was to be, again, as we'll see, if there was to be an insurrection, not only are you fighting the tyrant of that city-state, you're also fighting his big brother, right? Darius the Great, who's, it's just an incredible powerhouse of militaristic might. And an interesting, actually, a little side note, a little fun fact about Darius, he was the one who invented the satraps, right? And why this is significant, it's twofold. Riley had mentioned how they would have vassal states, right? They'd come in and say, hey, take care of us, pay us some taxes, give us some land, give us some troops, and we'll take care of you, right? Scratch my back, we'll scratch yours. Well, Darius was known for being a manager and a bookkeeper. He was actually called by Herodotus a shopkeeper, which was meant as an insult, because if you're a king, the last thing you want to be known as is a shopkeeper. So keep that in mind as we go through this episode and the next as to what his motivations may have been to expand into Greece, right? And maybe you could say it was an inevitability because empires tend to grow, right? There's no real, you don't see an empire that says, okay, yeah, I think we're good here, right? That's kind of the whole point of imperium, is you want as much land and power and people as possible. But that's one of the significant theories as to why Darius sought to take on Greece, was because it seemed like an easy target to get a notch on his belt and get rid of the title of shopkeeper. And in a cruel twist of fate, we will see that he'll go down in history as being a shopkeeper.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's actually a good example, though, of good leadership, right? Herodotus is writing retrospectively, like he's writing well into the future about Darius, but realistically,
100 years later,
realistically, being organized and being able to organize such a massive empire would have been a huge advantage for Darius. And, maybe he's not getting the recognition that he wants of being this great, military might, but he's actually really good at organizing his empire. And he does really well at sort of slowly expanding it. It's just every time he makes these big moves, it seems like he trips up a little bit. Yeah, but he does successfully acquire most of these city-states that are in the Aegean. And Darius, once he acquires these city-states that are in the Aegean, not only does he have access to most of the trade that the Greeks are doing, but he also has access to the main grain supply of Greece. So what's the next logical step? It's to invade Greece, right?
Yep. Now that we've briefly covered Darius and, the official, and for the listeners, air quotes, official arrival to Persia, of Persia to Greece, we'll have to get into the Ionian Revolution to really understand why the Battle of Marathon would take place 9 short years later. And worthy of note, we say official in quotations because this was not the first foray into Greece by the Persians, but it was the first foray that struck near to what would become the heart of Greek civilization, Athens. Cyrus the Great, 40 years earlier, had subdued much of Ionia and the east coast of the Aegean. And this was far enough away that the mainland Greeks felt secure, yet close enough that the shadow of Persia loomed over them. So, say if you're in California and there's riots going over in New York, you're going to yeah, we're fine, right? That's not going to get over here. And then...
Well, I actually wanted to touch on that a little bit because, especially if you're in North America, which most of our listeners are, our idea of land is often not as condensed as a European's idea of land would be, right? And it's really important to note that these Greek city-states that are Ionia, this is Western Turkey, like the most western border of modern-day Turkey. Now, I was looking on the map getting ready for this episode. The Aegean Sea is not much bigger than our biggest Great Lake, if you're Canadian or American and you know the Great Lakes. It's about 400 kilometers, okay? So, whereas, yeah, of course, at the time, it would have been quite difficult to travel 400 kilometers, especially by sea. But it is not by any stretch of the imagination some massive voyage, some massive distance away. Realistically, the Persians they're right at the Greeks' front door, right? And they have this little hop skip of water, and actually they can get around the water pretty easily as well. So it's not by any means, like you said, California to New York. That's actually, I don't know if that's the best example. That's a massive distance.
That's pretty far. Yeah,
right?
That's pretty far, yeah.
But in modern times, that would be a good example because we can travel so much faster. But realistically, this isn't by any means as far as people might think it is. And I think that a lot of Hollywood interpretations of this combat sort of shows the Persians descending from this distant empire, but that's not really what's going on. Ionia is essentially Greek. The people that are living there are pretty much Greek, and they're right there. They've been trading with Greece their entire existence in the region. They're very interconnected with Greece because they're actually quite close. So it's not a crazy voyage. It's not super super far by any stretch of the imagination. Like Ashton just said, it really is the shadow of Persia is just sort of looming over Greece at this time. It's enough of a distance and it's a big enough body of water that they don't feel an impending doom, but they're very much so well aware of what's going on. They're definitely keeping an eye, and the Ionian Revolt sort of, it's a great example of the Greeks jumping at an opportunity to maybe cause some discomfort in the region.
Absolutely. And you make really good points. And especially when you look towards the Roman Empire, right? What was Greece for them? Greece was kind of it was a means to get to the Near East, right? Greece in and of itself, yes, we consider it the beginning of Western civilization, but it was pretty far east relative to what would then become the epicenter of Western civilization, which was Rome, right? Because Rome's in Italy, which is, pretty close to the Atlantic Sea. You know what I mean? Like it's getting over there. But yeah, but that's actually a really good point to mention as well, because you'd have to imagine that a lot of the people who are inhabiting these cities along the east coast of the Aegean, well, who's to say, like, maybe the leaders identify as Greek, right? And maybe the populace identifies as Greek, but how many of them do you think actually are pretty okay with being subdued by the Persians, right? By Persian authority? Because by all accounts, the Persians were pretty decent to them, right? They allowed them to have, they'd be like, hey, you can play with your little democracy. It's okay. You're just going to pay us taxes, right? Like maybe they felt safe because if the Scythians came down, well, that's technically Persian territory. And if the Greeks weren't able to fight them, well, now they had Big Brother Persia there to help them out, right? So it's a weird dance between kind of like a cost benefit analysis. Like, what do you gain from being this vassal of Persia versus what do you lose by not having your independence and sovereignty as a Greek city state, right?
Well, I think that that's actually like a really good foray into what we're going to go into, because like you said, being under Persian rule, we're trying to dispel the myth that the Persians were this horrible, tyrannical ruler. Were they perfect, especially by modern standards? Absolutely not. But were they a bad ruler? Like, really by no means. And they offered, like you just said, a lot of really great benefits to paying them taxes. You would have been much more protected under the Persians. You would have, had, as Darius is the bookkeeper, you would have had a pretty stable tactical ruler leading you. However, let's talk about like who the Ionians are, and let's sort of dive into why this revolt happened, because I think that, in fact, there's evidence that over most of the Persian Empire, most people were pretty satisfied to be part of Persia, and they weren't really too stressed out about it. But the Ionians really aren't like most of the rest of the Persian Empire. Who are the Ionians? They are a civilization of free thinkers, relatively speaking, and Ionia had brought to the Greek world many things, philosophical thought, a study of geography and nature, a framework to assess the world scientifically, mathematically, as well as Ionia. They birthed a pretty pivotal man who encompassed all the tenets that would be the foundation of Western thought. Who is that, Ashton?
Thales of Miletus, and he was what many would consider the first man to utilize a scientific method of philosophy, to seek a naturalistic and mechanistic explanation of the world as opposed to religious or mythical. So, meaning like a scientific hypothesis, right? Like, say, I look at Riley and I think, okay, what would happen if I punch Riley in the face? Well, I can speculate and say, well, if you were to punch him in the face, the atoms in his face would simply dissipate because he's a divine being and they would not allow him to be touched, right? But then I test my hypothesis and I punch him in the face and I get punched back, right? And so now you do that again, and now you have repeat results, right? That's the beginning of the scientific method: test, retest, and then come up with a theory, right? And obviously this was in its infancy, but I digress. So why was Thales important? Well, as an individual for our story, he's not. He's actually really insignificant, and I bring him up only as an example. And what's he an example of? What an open-minded culture might produce. He's exactly what we need for this instance. So take this culture that had long been autonomous, art-loving, and forward-thinking, add in a dash of long-standing Persian authority and a sprinkle of longing for democracy, because they're looking over at Athens and seeing what they're doing over there. And what do you get? Well, you get a whole lot of kindling waiting for a spark. So I got to ask, well, who's better to begin a revolution than an ambitious man, as we've seen so often throughout history? We'd like to introduce you guys to Aristigoros. He enters our story in 499, titled The Tyrant of Miletus.
At this point in time, the cities of the East Aegean, they're controlled by tyrants. So the Persian Empire has referred to them as deputy governors, and they've appointed these guys, Darius has appointed these guys to be the local satrap.
After being approved by the local satrap. So Darius would go through Artaphornes and say, hey, this guy could be a tyrant. And then Artaphornes would be like, yeah, they're good, yeah.
Yeah, and it's really cool because the western capital of the Persian Empire, the Persians, they had this hands-off style of ruling, and they thought it was wise to implant Greeks to rule Greek cities as tyrants, though they were beholden to the Persian authority. And Aristigoros, he becomes a pretty interesting character, and I think that that's a great example, touching back what we talked about earlier. Yes, they're putting Greeks in to rule Greek cities, but they're specifically choosing guys, like you just said, the satrap. He officially allows this guy to be chosen, and that's because these are guys that are seeking power, and they're guys that they think the Persian Empire is going to be beneficial to their own goals, right? These tyrants, they're like, okay, working with the Persians will help my own goals. And the Persian style is, hey, if these guys can govern themselves, less of our intervention, and then they do well and they keep paying us taxes, it's a win for us as well.
There's a hint of arrogance there, though, hey, if you're the Persian Empire, because like you're looking for a guy that's ambitious, right? Because an ambitious man will, like, utilizing the power of Persia, will act to seek his own gain. But it's like you're playing with fire in the sense that how do you know that this ambitious man won't supersede what you've given him to try to absorb even more power, right? And that's exactly what we see with Aristigoros. So in 499 BC, a group of exiles from the island of Naxos arrived in Miletus, petitioning Aristigoros for aid. He weighed his options, and the conclusion he came to, as any tyrant would, was that he now was presented with the opportunity to be both ruler of Miletus and the wealthy island of Naxos. And of course, being the puppet of Darius, he sought Artaphernes, the satrap's, support. After some deliberation, it was granted. Darius would allow him 200 triremes, led by the Persian Admiral Megabates. I want to mention these triremes. This is actually, again, coming back to the whole bookkeeper, shopkeeper, managerial style of Darius as an emperor or king. They weren't actually Persian. They were Phoenician, right? And if you know much about the Mediterranean, Phoenicians are the ancestors of the Carthaginians. And Phoenicians are arguably one of the most developed at the ancient time in the world seafaring civilizations, right? So he doesn't need to go and say, well, scratch his head and be like, well, how are we going to get over to all these islands? Oh, he doesn't have to worry about that. He's like, we got the money. He's like, just go pay these guys. And he's like, come on over here. We'll take care of you guys. You do what you do best. We'll do what we do best. We pay you. You fight for us. Everybody wins, right? And a little fun fact about Naxos. We're full of these today, these fun facts, probably because history is so fun. They actually successfully repelled an attempt of conquest by the Persians in 502. And this event likely played a role in their decision, inevitably, to side with the Greeks during the Ionian Revolt.
I wanted to note, too, though, you mentioned these 200 triremes, like, it's not like they're having trouble getting them. This is still a massive invasion force, even for the Persians. This is still a big commitment for the Persians to be sort of giving Aristigoros this opportunity to take these 200 ships and go conquest Naxos. Like, this isn't a small invasion force. So I think that also shows you there is definitely a pretty high level of trust that the Persians have with most of their tyrants. So for the most part, you have to assume that this system of instilling tyrants into your cities is working pretty well for them. Like, they've got a pretty big success rate that these guys are staying loyal to the Persian Empire, that they're willing to give such a massive invasion force. Even for the Persians, 200 triremes is a lot of boats, and I think that massive commitment also comes into play because Naxos did successfully defeat them already. So maybe there's a bit of ego back in it again. As we mentioned, Darius, he's not really been that successful at his big military conquests up to this point. But it's definitely a strange relationship to decipher, where they're trusting this guy, Aristigoros, with so much power. And I think it's interesting. It was interesting and hard for me to wrap my head around.
I agree, but you have to, like, what I just realized now as you were talking, I was listening to you and I'm like, yeah, you're right. You know what? That makes sense. Why would they give this guy this much authority? But what we're doing in that line of thought is we're restricting ourselves to that simply Western worldview and looking at Greece, right? Because the Persians are doing this all over the place, man. Like, we don't know a lot about what was going on in the East with Persia, in India, maybe even closer to China, maybe going a bit more south, maybe involving themselves more in Africa. Like, we don't actually have a solid idea, right? So for all we're aware, we look at it and we're like, wow, maybe the Persians are a little arrogant giving all this power to these Greeks, right? But maybe they have a good track record with these guys. Maybe they have their little birds instilled in all these cities, so they know when this guy needs to, like when it's time to cut the cord on these guys. But so maybe what we're looking at as Aristigoros being, well, obviously this is going to happen. Maybe it's an exception to the rule because of how good the Persians actually became at statecraft, right? Like, have you thought about that? Because that just kind of occurred to me.
Honestly, like, I have thought about that because I think I just mentioned it a little earlier in the podcast that they must have been having a pretty successful track record with their puppet states. But it's honestly even bigger is how intricate that network of people would be to organize. That would be incredibly diverse You're talking about people that aren't speaking the same languages. They don't have the same ethnicities. They're all over the place. The Persian Empire is massive, but it's also diverse, full of different people. And you even look at today in modern society, like minor differences in cultures still cause some conflict. And the Persians are somehow able to maintain this unbelievably diverse network of sub-kingdoms within their massive kingdom. So like you said, yeah, it's definitely, even to sort of organize such an incredibly massive network, not only do they sort of have to rely on their subjects and they sort of have to rely on these sub-rulers to expand, but they sort of have to, you have to assume these guys had an insane ability of statecraft, like almost, it's almost unbelievable. Because in comparison, you can't even think of an empire in modern day that did that successfully and lasted that long. Like the USSR, they established a lot of puppet states, but in the grand scheme of things, they weren't around for very long. So to see that the Persians are effectively doing that, not only does that suggest that they were good at statecraft, but it also helps us see that the Persians probably, for the most part, really were not bad rulers. They must have been pretty decent. People must have been okay with being under Persian rule.
Well, yeah, they learned pretty quickly, right? Like that, like they'd allow people to practice their religions, right? They'd allow people to practice their local forms of government and all that jazz that makes a populace happy. And to your point about the USSR and all their puppet states, I wonder, and this is speculation, this isn't my opinion, but I wonder if that has to do something to do with more of a globalized world now, right? Because back then with less opportunity and less resources, all that, the resources and the power being more localized into these groups of local rulers and tyrants. And if you're just some dude out in a field tilling and some Persian guy walks up to you and says, "Hey, do you want to come fight for Darius? We'll give you a paycheck and food," right? And you've got nothing else going on to you except getting basically smacked around by your local ruler. Who cares if you're, Numidian? Who cares if you're Ionian? You're getting paid and you're getting a better life than what you currently have. So you're like, hell yeah, I'm a Persian now, right? Like there's no question. Whereas nowadays there's more hard and fast lines because we're all so interconnected that people try to find the one or two things that they distinctly hold on to that makes them them. But back then, like, you don't even know your lineage, man. You just know you were born by this city called Babylon, right? You might not even refer to yourself as a Babylonian. Maybe the elites and the aristocracy in Babylon might, but you're just Joe from the field, right?
Yeah, I do find that interesting though, because I think that's an important difference between the Ionians and specifically the Greeks with sort of the rest of the Persian Empire, is that they do find pride in where they're from, especially the Athenians, because they have this thing that, they call democracy and it makes them feel very involved. So it's interesting to decipher. But at the end of the day, Aristigoros has 200 ships and he's sailing towards Naxos.
So this expedition, it would effectively fail before they ever reached the island. Aristigoros and Megabates would suffer a falling out. It is said, and again, this is Herodotus' Histories that's telling us this, and Herodotus he's a bit of an ancient storyteller, right? Like that's the way history was told for a long time, was like they want to tell a compelling story. So if sometimes things, like Riley said earlier, sound really Hollywood, maybe that's because they're talking it up to make it that way, right? Because a lot of the stuff was performed as plays, you know what I mean? So there'd be the Greek guy on the ship standing up, "You are not going to do that to my friend." Greeks didn't have a British accent, but nonetheless. They would suffer a falling out, Aristigoros and Megabates. It is said that one of Aristigoros' close friends, a captain, failed to set up a watch on one of the ships, and when Megabates, the commander of the mission, set out to discipline him, Aristigoros intervened. This act had led Megabates losing faith and trust in Aristigoros, severing the will for cooperation. Herodotus, in his Histories, says that Megabates then went on to forewarn the citizens of Naxos of the impending attack, eliminating the element of surprise. Well, why, you ask? Because he's a part of this mission as well? Well, he's a Persian. Aristigoros is a tyrant. He's an ally of Persia, not a Persian. So, perhaps it was to embarrass Aristigoros for his transgression against Megabates. He was, after all, the one who had the idea in the first place. And 4 short months later, the siege would be lifted. Aristigoros had failed in what he set out to do, and now was left to answer to Artaphernes, the satrap, and Darius, the king of Persia. So you could see how ego got in the way there a little bit, and he figured, you know what, I'm squared away, I'm good to go, I can just put it all on this guy. We're going to fail this mission. We're Persia, we'll get it when we want to get it, we don't need his help. And that is what begins the Ionian Revolt. Is that moment when Aristigoros realizes that he has failed, and now he must answer to Darius and Artaphornes. And what do you think answering to them probably meant? Probably meant losing his title, his power, and quite possibly his life.
Yeah, and I think that something that's important to note about Aristigoros is even though he is a tyrant, and even though that he doesn't seem to hold any allegiance towards anyone, really. He's very good at bouncing around and switching sides and using leverage or bribery or anything to sort of get himself into a position of power. So I think we can note something that we can note about Aristigoros is priority one for this guy is power. This guy, he wants to be a great leader. He's motivated to rule an empire. So after this failure, and like I touched on earlier, this isn't a small failure. This was a big commitment by the Persian Empire to send this many troops to Naxos. They were most likely expecting a pretty easy win. They're like, dude, we're giving you this massive fleet. Come on, get the win. And he fails. So in a situation like this where Persia has no shortage of potential tyrants and potential rulers to replace Aristigoros with. They've got no shortage. So it's assumed that at minimum, he's probably going to lose his power. And at maximum, he might lose his head. We don't really know how the Persians would have responded to such defeat. But Aristigoros, I think he's not ready to lose his position. I don't think he's ready to lose his place in power because he's probably getting nice and cozy with drinking wine every night and hanging out. He's probably really enjoying this, and it's about to get taken away.
I think it's interesting, briefly, how you mentioned the little dance that people would play to maintain their power, right? How you can switch allegiance here and there. It speaks a lot to leverage and its importance in history, right? Because maybe at one point in 499, you're just some chump. Then 498, you've put yourself into a position where maybe you control a resource that somebody else wants who was previously your enemy. And then in 497, you guys are now allies, but then something happens. And in 496, you're once again enemies, right? How when you put two egos together, both who seek to gain something, those differences dissolve if it means that there's mutual benefit. But the moment that mutual benefit evaporates, it's right back at each other's throats, right? I think that's just a little interesting thought about how humans work. Because we
the
work
enemy
this way
of my
even
enemy
today.
is my friend.
Yeah, we work that way even today, if you're as an example, think of how often this might happen in the corporate world where you get close and cuddled up to your supervisor and you're his subordinate and you guys become really good friends or whatnot, but then you see an opportunity where maybe he slips up and you could drive the knife down, right? You could put the knife into the heart and, who becomes the next supervisor? Well, you. So all of a sudden that friendship that you leveraged that benefit both of you now seek, the benefit was disproportionate in your favor. So now you would discard that friend of yours, right? The ruthlessness with which humans seek to climb hierarchies, right? That just a little commentary.
Yeah, and I think that Aristigoros is a good example of this ruthlessness because right after he fails, this time he goes to seek aid again, but it's not Persian aid. Instead, he goes to undermine Persian authority. And Aristigoros, he casts off his mantle as tyrant of Miletus, and instead fashioning himself as, the man who would usher in democracy for the people of Ionia. He tries to totally change his position of power, right? He's lost his position of power with the Persians, but he's been ruler of these people over here in Miletus. So he's making sure to go to the right people to get power. Okay, I've lost my power with the Persians. I'm not getting that back. Well, I've still got these people in Ionia. What if I introduce them as, pivot, I'm not actually this tyrant. I'm actually going to usher in democracy. Overnight, what do you think? He just completely changed his opinion as a human being? Oh no, actually, I would like to be democratic. I'm giving up my power for you, the people, which is, of course, by no means what happens, right?
Yeah, and he, whether by design or simply circumstance, this abdication of his position as tyrant for the sake of democracy led to him being in a higher position of authority, not lesser. So he would go on to form an alliance with other Ionian cities, right? And it's interesting because what did Miletus offer to leverage these cities away from Persia? Because bear in mind, these other tyrants were beholden to Artaphorus, the satrap, right? So Miletus must have had some power. I'm not too sure what it may have been that allowed them to come to his side. And what Aristigoros then did when he had this council of people, he established isonomia, which roughly translates to an equality of government. In his attempts to bring democracy to the other cities of Ionia, Aristigoros assumed a leadership role. I'm laughing because it's just funny, right? He assumed a leadership role, requesting that the allied cities would provide a council of generals for him to advise, and we can assume answer to him. So, contrary to his claims of democracy, these actions actually leveraged Aristigoros to be the head of a new nation. This new state had the ability to levy taxes and raise troops with its capital in Miletus. Though short-lived, this sovereign Ionia would go on to issue its own unique coinage that lasted from 499 to 494. A little fun fact. So, as Riley was saying, yeah, this I want to say weasel because it seems a little weaselly. This weasel is like, hey, Persia, I can help you guys take this rich island. He fails, and then he's like, oh, no, we're good, bro. It's all good. I'm just going to head back to my city and chill. We'll figure out. I'll come talk to you guys. You can punish me. I get it. And then he rips off his cloak and he's like, think fast, people of Miletus. I'm a democratic person. Let's go. And then he goes to all the other places. He's like, guys, crazy idea. How about all of you stop being rulers and we all become democratic, but I'm the ruler of all of you, but we're all democratic. Like we're democratic, but I'm the most democratic.
All people are equal, but I am slightly more equal than all of you.
Exactly.
All of your opinions matter, mildly less than mine. I'll take it. Yeah. I am this being of utter knowledge. That's what he's saying, right? He's like, I am going to be able to just take in everything you guys are saying, and I'm going to very democratically rule this new state.
You guys give me your power, you don't fight me on it. You forsake Persia, and we'll all work together under my purview, but we're all working together, you got to take a minute to just think of imagine that happening today, bro. Imagining I don't know, imagine like 4 provinces in Canada, maybe all BC, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba all get together, and all the premiers are like, hey, you know what? We're going to be even more democratic. And then, Jason Kenney's like, yeah, but I'm the most democratic. And now Canada splits into 2, right? That's kind of what happened here is they had a new nation formed under the guise of democracy, which is just so absurd.
Well, and it just becomes it doesn't last long, so we can't really say that this was some great country, but it was instantly super corrupt. I think we can say that. What's that?
It was corrupt, but yeah, it was we're laughing about it, but it was actually very necessary for the seriousness of what was going on to kind of get back on track. They basically all just forsook Persia, right? So now they had this tyrant leaning over them, and they needed to band together because fire and brimstone was headed their way. So all jokes aside, right, for a moment, don't let us think that it's comedic, right? This was life or death for the Ionians at this point and the people of the East Aegean. So it makes sense as to why they would have formed this single nation, right? It's the same way that in Rome, there would be dictators appointed in times of crisis, because at a point you can't have a council making decisions. When Hannibal Barca is coming over the Alps with a bunch of war elephants into Italy, you don't really have the time to sit there and deliberate on what the next course of action is, right?
Yeah, and so like you said, it's a good point too. And as we mentioned before, the Persians, they're quite peaceful and hands off when you are willing to work with them. But the second you're like, we're going to revolt against you, the Persians, they've proven time and time again, they will crush you and enslave your people. It's not like the Persians are going to be like, oh, no worries, a little bit of a revolt, a little revolty poo.
Mm-hmm.
No, they're not going to do that. They're going to come in and they're going to crush you. And then they're going to enslave half of your population. And then they're going to say, if you ever try to do that again, we'll burn your cities to the ground. So it's serious. And Aristigoros, he's set up something serious. And he knows that realistically, Ionia is not going to be able to defeat the Persians alone. So the first thing he does is he goes over to Sparta, right? He goes and he meets with the most notorious warriors on the planet at the time. And he seeks the aids of Cleomenes, the king of Sparta. And he begins with flattery and embellishment, professing to the king that the conquest of Persia would be easy as their soldiers were inferior to the mighty Spartans, fighting in turbans and trousers, clearly no match for the superior bronze of the Greeks, right? Well, that failed. And then he tried to bribe the king, which Aristigoros had no problem with bribery. And he's bribing them with these easily attainable riches of Persia. And then Cleomenes' daughter, Gorgo, she suggests that he might be corrupted, which I think that he's proven at this point. She's correct. So
and with the Spartans, and just a fun fact I wanted to add, Lacedaemon was actually the original name of Sparta. I think that sounds cool as hell. Lacedaemon, no, never mind. I can't even say it now. Lacedaemonians, right? That's a bit more legit than Spartans, but yeah, Spartans were all about honor. You know what I mean? So imagine like the threat of corruption was real for them. They want their integrity. But sorry, continue, Riley.
Well, no, it's just I was actually going to sort of dive into that. How it's interesting that the Spartans are for such a famously warring people, they were quite cautious with all the decisions they make over the course of history.
I'm actually glad you brought that up, because a little known fact about Greece, as we know, with Greece being able to repel the Persians, and well, for a time, but a little known fact about Greece and Sparta in particular, Sparta was the only professional army in Greece, right? So, like, looking back historically, Sparta might not have been as scary as we're led to believe. They're probably great warriors, right? They were a professional army, but imagine it's like, in high school, there's that one kid on the football team who might be a little bit taller, and maybe he goes to the gym a little bit with his dad, and he's got like in the real world, he's got little baby biceps, but in high school, he's got big biceps. So everybody thinks this guy is just jacked and just like ready to get some. But, you put him up against somebody who's, fight somebody your own size, and, it's that spectacular image immediately dissipates. Well, that was Sparta at this time in Greece. Later on in Greek history, there would be professional standing armies, but at this time, Athens and Ionia and all the big cities, like they were predominantly cultural and artsy city-states, more so than they were militaristic or martial.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's definitely a big myth that the Spartans were this massive force of just bloodthirsty warriors. Like, sure, they've got some professional soldiers. Most of their society still doesn't even consist of professional soldiers. Like, that's only a small part of their society. They're by no means some big military force. So with his patience wearing thin, Cleomenes, he asks Aristigoros, how long is this journey going to be to go fight the Persians? And Aristigoros, he says 3 months travel. And I'm sure that he's dumbing it down. Yeah, he's like, and Cleomenes, he's already not really believing this guy at this point. So he probably instantly is like, yeah, 3 months my ass. It's going to be 5-6 months. And I can't leave my city undefended for that amount of time, because Greece, all the city-states are consistently warring with each other. So they've got like enemies right on their doorstep, and he's not going to go on this 6-month journey to fight Persians, which is already this massive empire, when he's going to leave his borders unprotected. So
yeah, and the closest city that they're currently warring with, the name eludes me, but it was like 28 miles away. So that's like, what, like 2 days march, if that, right? So yeah, so you're not going to take all those men and leave. But with the Spartans opting out, Aristigoros was headed to Athens. And for the next probably 3 or 4 minutes, bear with me, you might have to go back on this part once or twice. I'll try to sum it up nicely at the end, but it gets a little crazy, and there's a lot of names. Let's get into it. So, a brief note on the Athens-Persian relations prior to the revolt. In 510 BC, so about 12 years prior to this, Athens, with the help of Cleomenes, the Spartan king that we were just referencing, ousted the current tyrant Hippias. Hippias would then go to Artapherne in Sardis, remember he was the satrap, pledging Athens to Persia if they would help him recover his rule. So a tyrant, Hippias, got kicked out of Athens and sought the help of a Persian satrap, Artapherne in Sardis. Okay, bear with me. In the meantime, Cleomenes, the king of Sparta, had instilled a pro-Spartan tyrant, Isagoras, in Athens. At this point, Clisthenes, who was an Athenian, whose family had ruled Athens for 36 of the last 50 years, proposed radical change. Athens was to become a democracy. For this proposal, Clisthenes and his family were exiled from Athens by the aristocracy. But having received the promise of democracy, the people of Athens revolted. They expelled Cleomenes, the king of Sparta, and Isagoras, the Spartan puppet, and restored Clisthenes to power. This was in 507 BC. And there are no easy victories, however, and Cleomenes would soon march on Athens. Fearing his reprisal, because remember, the Spartans had a professional army, the Athenians had sent a delegation to Artaphernes requesting aid. Typical of the Persians, Artaphernes had requested earth and water, which the delegation mistakenly gave. Shortly thereafter, Cleomenes was added again with a plot to restore the initial tyrant, Hippias. So Hippias got ousted in 510, Hippias went to Sardis, and then he came back. Cleomenes had instilled Isagoras, right? So then they kicked out Isagoras in 507 and put Clisthenes in. And now Cleomenes wanted Athens. So now he tried to restore Hippias because Isagoras didn't work. And as you'd expect, the plot failed, and Hippias was sent running to Artaphernes, again in Sardis. Simultaneously, the Athenians had dispatched their own delegation to Sardis in hopes to dissuade Artaphernes of his potential support for Hippias. It was then that Artaphernes' solution was that the Athenians were to take back Hippias as tyrant. And having just become a democracy, the Athenians abhorred the idea. And seeing firsthand what the Persians would have them become, well, needless to say, they did not need much more motivation to fight against the inevitable subjugations the enemies of Persia faced. So to recap, Sparta helped Athens kick out their tyrant Hippias. Hippias then went to Artaphernes in Persia, seeking aid. It wasn't granted. In the meantime, Cleomenes instilled a new puppet, Isagoras, who was then kicked out in 507 by Clisthenes and the people because of his promise of democracy. Cleomenes then tried to reinstill Hippias and failed. Hippias went and sought help from the Persians again, but at the same time, the Athenians went and tried to dissuade him from helping because they knew that if Persia was to invade at this time, they surely would have fallen. And the Persians told the Athenians to give them earth and water, or to just take Hippias back as tyrant. So, to summarize, the Athenians had just broken free of tyrant control, established democracy, and the only response the Persians had were, "We're not helping you, just take your tyrant back." So you could see how, 10 short years later during the revolution, they would be a little unwilling to bend to Persia. They saw an opportunity to attack. They knew what was in store. If Persia was to come knocking on their doorstep, they made the right decision. Was that clear, Riley? Did I mess that up at all?
No, man, I think that was as clear as it's going to be within the time frame we're working with, right? Because that's a lot of information to get. To summarize the summary, Athens doesn't like Persia, right? And
everybody was running to Dad, but he did this. No, but he did this. Yeah.
Yeah, but the thing is now the Athenians, who are a proud people, they've got democracy, or they have what they
proto-democracy.
Yeah, they're sort of figuring out what it is. But they now have pride as people, and freedom under democracy is a priority for them, and they understand that the Persians don't like that. At this point, at least, the Persians aren't going to be helping with that at all. So once Aristigoros comes here and he says, "Hey man, I've already got a big military in Persian territory that is going to fight back. Can you help us?" The Athenians, they see this as a perfect opportunity to cause a problem within the Persian Empire. And as we'll see over the course of all history, guerrilla warfare and small sort of revolts and small military operations can cause massive negative effects within an empire. And the Ionian Revolt is a great example of that because it happens in multiple parts of the Persian Empire, and it really does take them a couple years, quite a few thousand soldiers to quell. But it only costs the Athenians 20 triremes, which obviously is a big amount of troops for the Athenians to send over, and then we compare it to the 200 that the Persians sent to Naxos, just to give you an idea of the difference in sizes of these empires.
That's a 1-to-10 ratio. One trireme of the Athenians per Persian 10.
But to add that to the already large Ionian forces that would have been in Ionia, it's actually going to be a pretty formidable enemy, right? And so once the Athenians get there and the Eretrians get there, the Ionians decide to go on the offensive. And with the combined forces of the Ionians, Athenians, Eretrians that landed in Ephesus, they're led by the Ephesians, they would maneuver through the mountains towards Sardis.
And once arrived, the Greeks caught the Persians off guard because they weren't expecting this reprisal this soon. And having succeeded in entering the city, The Greeks were emboldened. Before long, however, a blaze would erupt, whether intentional or not, we won't know. But what this did was force the garrison troops at Sardis to descend from the fortified citadel of the inner city and engage the Greeks in the marketplace. And the Greeks were defeated and pushed back. Demoralized, they retreated to Ephesus. So you have to think, like, that's pretty substantial. Like, to get Darius's attention, this little revolt, this group of Greeks, they just went and stormed and actually gained entrance to the western capital of the Empire of Persia in Sardis, where the satrap Artaphornes, who basically managed all of Greece, was located. So that's nothing to wag your tail at, right? That's pretty intense. And, the fire started and the troops didn't really have a choice. It's either burn to death down here or go fight. And when you back an animal into a corner, you don't want to be the one that's engaging with that animal. And the Greeks were defeated. A little fun note about Darius. This is what I love about Greek history, man. And Herodotus, like, he's funny. Like, just like you could easily see him sitting there like, you know what, the story needs something cooler, right? Like, yeah, this is cool facts and all, but like, where's the mystique and the grandeur, right? And this was in his histories that upon hearing of the burning of Sardis, legend has it that Darius had tasked his slaves with reminding him 3 times a day, "Master, remember the Athenians," right? How dramatic is that?
Super dramatic. I think that's a bit more of a building onto what's to come for the Athenians, because really, realistically, it was mostly the Ionians that did this invasion. The majority of the attack was Ionian forces, but you mentioned how the fire, it could have been an accident, it could have been intentional, but this is at a time where fire in a city is seriously destructive. And Sardis gets like obliterated. This fire does an unbelievable amount of damage to the city. So I think that it's important to note that not only has you mentioned, I forget the word for it, but it's when you win, but the cost of the win is
Pyrrhic victory.
Yeah,
Pyrrhic victory.
The battle at Sardis is sort of a Pyrrhic victory because realistically, sure, he wins, but his capital is like demolished, and the people that are living there, they had these Greeks inside their city. So it's sure he won, sure he repelled the Greeks, but it's definitely a massive hit, not only to his ego, but to his mostly delicate ruling of this area. Right?
Yeah,
so it's an important battle.
You got to imagine the cities in Ionia, the peoples of Ionia who they get word. What? You're telling me that Aristigoros' forces had broken into Sardis, right? That they're going to be emboldened and be like, all right, well, let's get after it, right?
And actually other places within the Persian Empire, which happened during this. Right? There's other places like down...
That started revolting, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, upon hearing of the attack on Sardis, the Persian forces stationed in Asia Minor would assemble to come to the aid of Artaphornes. They would track the Greeks back to Ephesus, wherein they decimated them outside the city walls. It was here, and this is where our story of the Ionian Revolution comes to an end, and that is something we will inevitably cover as a series because it's 5 long years of battle and a lot of interesting things. But it's here, after the twin defeats at Sardis and now Ephesus, that the coalition fell apart. The Athenians and Erythraeans returned home to Greece. The Ionians would continue fighting for 4 more years. The revolt would inevitably come to an end in 494 BC after the Ionian defeat at the Battle of Lade. Now, 2 years later, Darius would appoint his son-in-law, Mardonius, to set out with an expedition towards Athens, consisting of a navy and land troops. In doing so, they eliminated the remaining tyrants of Ionia, and ironically, appointed democracies. We had mentioned this earlier, how they're like, oh, you want your little democracy? Do you want your little democracy? Right? And they gave it to them. And the land expedition would eventually actually make it to Macedon, or Macedon, removing its vassal status and co-opting it as a full-fledged part of the empire. So you can see the Macedonians, they're a vassal state as of 513 BC. Way over in Ionia, the Greeks are getting uppity. So then Persia's like, you know what, bro? No, you're not a vassal anymore. You're you're my puppet. So they removed its vassal status, and at this point, though, the navy would not be so lucky, and in transport, whilst attempting to round Mount Athos, a violent storm would ravage the Persian navy. Herodotus estimates that there were 300 ships lost and around 20,000 men. Simultaneously, a Macedonian tribe would attack the Persian camp at nightfall, subjecting them to heavy losses. The Athenians had been granted more time. The Persians were still coming, though it would not be in 492. No, they would arrive to partake in the Battle of Marathon eventually. And there's when you look back at it, it's a pretty It's a pretty fantastic story. Like that's what it is, right? It's a story. You could see this being made into a movie of how, one man's power grab led to an eruption in the East of just like it's just a catastrophic chain of events that led to what will be covered in our next episode, the Battle of Marathon.
Something I did want to cover too was how this is in pop culture history. You see the Battle of Marathon and the Battle at Thermopylae, and you think that the Persians were no match for the Greeks. You see those two battles in Western society as these like great examples of these Greek guys that had this awesome armor and they were just way more powerful. And not to give away, what was going to happen then in the next episode, but this, especially the Ionian Revolt and the two defeats that they suffered at Sardis and then, later as well, that to me was just a great example of the fact that, no, the Persian Empire is serious. They are a serious military force. Maybe their individual soldiers don't have as good armor or whatever, but they are a massive military force that is good at warfare. They will crush you, and it's not like these battles that, eventually continued with the Greeks and the Persians, as we'll get into more in the next episode, were easy wins for the Greeks. And I think that this story and this episode, hopefully what it did was sort of remind you just how serious and formidable of an enemy the Persians really were. This was by no means a small undertaking to meet the Persians on the battlefield. These guys were the big dog of the world at the time. There was no one, we look back in history, especially being from Western cultures, we see Greece as the birthplace of Western culture. And
that's the home team.
Right, exactly. But realistically, when you sort of step back and look at it, the Greeks are minute compared to the size of the Persian Empire.
They're a little cultural backwater, right? Like what I like to compare it to is like, what the Gauls would have been to the Romans, right? Like they had their little functions, their own little city states, their own little religions and political ideals, but they were, they were crushed under heel by the Romans, right? That's kind of a comparison between what the Persians or what the Greeks were to the Persians.
Exactly. So now that I've sort of reminded us all about what's to come, I will say that it is said that along with the reminder of the Athenians' treachery, Darius had also taken a bow and shot an arrow towards the heavens, declaring Zeus, that it may be granted to me to take vengeance upon the Athenians. And that's what we'll get into next week's episode on Human Histories, which will be on the Battle of Marathon. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. I'm going to dive back into how to support the podcast. I forgot to mention it earlier, but the best way to support the podcast, first and foremost, is to hit subscribe or follow, because we do this every week, and we're going to be diving into more cool areas in history. Another great way is to go to thehumanhistoriespodcast.com. From that website, you'll be able to email us at questions@humanhistoriespodcast.com. Shoot us questions, tell us things we missed, ask us, to do certain topics. We'd love to hear from you guys. Also, you can get our sources for all the episodes. So we have all of our books that we use to sort of read up and prepare for these episodes. We have all those linked under affiliate links, so that supports the podcast if you buy through the website. And you can also donate on our Patreon, where you'll get access to all the show notes. Another great way is just follow the Instagram at Human Histories Podcast on Instagram. I'm Riley Osborne with my co-host Ashton Myers. I just wanted to thank you guys for listening. It's a pleasure doing this show.
Have a great day, everybody.